This was back in late October 2018. I think it was the 24th. Or maybe the 25th. Me and my buddy Frank were doing contract timber cruising out in the Black River State Forest, down near the southern edge of Section 14. If you've never done timber cruising before, it's mostly just tedious, lonely work. You spend hours walking grid patterns through dense timber, measuring tree diameters, taking basal area counts, checking canopy density, and logging plot data for private logging firms or state records. You're out in the scrub all day, far off the main fire roads, usually up to your knees in wet brush and leaf mold. It had been drizzling since daylight. That miserable, freezing cold Midwest rain that just hangs in the air like a damp curtain and eats right through your wool layers no matter how many heavy thermal coats you stack on underneath. My skin was numb, my boots were coated in heavy black clay, and my shoulders were stiff from hauling a cruiser's axe, ribbon rolls, and a heavy gear pack through the underbrush. I zipped my canvas jacket up to my chin, pulled my muddy gloves tight, and looked down at my Garmin handheld. The satellite lock was drifting bad. It kept dropping connection every few yards, flicking our mapped location back and forth across a 300-yard radius every few seconds. On a mapping run like that, a jumpy GPS makes taking reliable plot data pretty much impossible. "You getting a decent satellite lock yet?" Frank asked me. He was standing near a damp pine stump, wiping cold rain off his forehead with the back of his canvas glove. Frank was a bigger guy, 10 years older than me, spent his whole life working timber cuts across northern Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula. Not the kind of guy who gets bothered by bad weather or rough terrain. "No," I said, tapping the screen with a stiff thumb. "It's acting up again. Kept losing horizontal signal every time we walked under those spruce tops." "Pines," he grunted, walking over to squint down at the glowing LCD screen. "Canopy's too thick up ahead. Dense needle pack blocks out the high signals every time." "I've used this same Garmin in way denser hardwoods than this," I told him, clearing the error screen. "It's never done this jumpy stuff before. Look at the elevation readout. It says we're 50 feet below sea level." Frank didn't really have an answer for that. He just grunted again, staring into the dark pine trunks off to our left. We decided to head up toward a low glacial ridge about 100 yards east to see if getting up higher would clear the signal lock so we could calibrate the grid points. I pocketed the GPS, grabbed my cruising stick, and we started picking our way through the dense underbrush, boots crunching on wet acorns and decaying pine needles. That was when the forest noise cut out. I didn't notice it immediately. But after maybe 50 yards of pushing through soaked fern stalks, I realized how dead silent everything had gone. If you work out in the woods long enough, you get used to the background noise. There's always something moving around you, crows calling in the high canopy, chickadees flitting through the scrub oak, gray squirrels barking, the wind working through the pine needles. But suddenly, every bit of it just snapped off. No bird calls. No wind in the upper branches. No sound at all except the wet crunch of our heavy leatherwork boots through the dead leaves. "Frank," I said, coming to a stop. "You hear that?" He stopped right behind me, his boot sliding slightly in the slick mud. He paused, turning his head. "Hear what?" "Nothing. Everything just stopped." He stood there for a few seconds, taking off his wet glove to scratch his jaw while he listened. The quiet was heavy, unnatural and thick, like stepping inside an insulated recording studio with the lights turned off. Then Frank reached out and pointed at a mature white pine right next to his shoulder. "Check this out." I took a couple steps over to join him. Carved right into the bark of the pine trunk were surveyor blazes. But they weren't normal forestry slashes. Standard survey marks are simple hatch marks, corner notches, or painted boundaries. These were weird, smooth, curved gouges cut exceptionally deep into the living wood, spiraling inward like concentric rings cut with a curved gouge chisel. They were worn smooth on the inside, completely free of dried pine sap or fresh wood shavings, as if they'd been cut years ago and carved over and over again. Right about then, the air smelled entirely different. Up until that second, the forest had smelled like typical wet October woods, decaying oak leaves, damp earth, and pine rot. But suddenly, the air tasted dry in the back of my throat. Like stepping into an old root cellar. Moldy dirt, stale concrete, dusty stone, and powdered chalk. The kind of dry, dead air you breathe in when you pull open a storm cellar door that's been sealed shut under a farmhouse since the 60s. What do you make of those marks? I walked slowly along the outer edge of the wall. It wasn't just a basic circular enclosure, it was a spiral. A tight, deliberate pathway leading inward toward the center of the clearing. "Mark, don't touch anything," Frank said, his hand hovering near his belt. I didn't listen. I took a step onto the dry, leaves-covered dirt of the spiral path. The dry bone fragments buried under my boots clicked and popped like hard plastic under my weight. I leaned down and looked closer at the construction. Mouse mandibles and tiny rodent jaws were jammed precisely into the eye sockets of white-tailed deer skulls to lock the structure tightly into place. It looked mathematical. Like a puzzle someone had taken years to fit together piece by piece. I followed the curving path until I reached the absolute center of the spiral. There was a hole in the ground. It was a round shaft, maybe a foot wide, dropping straight down into the black dirt. A faint breeze was blowing upward out of the hole. It was lukewarm, blowing against my face in small, rhythmic puffs. It smelled like wet slate and ozone, like the sharp, ionized air you smell right before a lightning strike during a midsummer thunderstorm. "Frank," I called out over my shoulder. "Come look at this." He walked down the path, stepping carefully on the dry leaves, making sure not to brush up against the bone walls. He leaned over my shoulder to look down into the dark opening. "Is that?" He trailed off, his jaw tight. I pulled my long metal mag light out of my pack pocket, clicked the button, and shined the beam straight down into the dark shaft. The bright yellow beam went down maybe 10 or 15 feet before angling off sharply to the side. But the dirt walls of the shaft were what made my stomach turn over. The dirt walls were lined with teeth. Hundreds of small herbivore teeth, deer molars, sheep teeth, rodent incisors, goat teeth, embedded directly into the packed mud, forming dense, concentric rows all the way down the circular throat of the hole. They were arranged neatly, crown out, roots pressed deep into the clay like the teeth inside the maw of some subterranean lamprey. Then I felt the hum. It wasn't loud. It was a high-frequency vibration, almost too high for the human ear to register, but I could feel it buzzing in my molars and vibrating through the marrow of my knee joints. "Mark," Frank whispered. His voice was shaking, something I had never heard in the 10 years I'd known him. "I don't like this. We need to go back to camp. Now." "Yeah," I said, switching off the flashlight. "Okay." The sky was getting dark unnaturally fast, the heavy grey clouds sagging low over the tree canopy above us. We turned around, scrambled up the slippery dirt embankment, and hiked as fast as we could back out of the glacial bowl. Neither of us said a word the entire mile-and-a-half hike back to our makeshift timber camp. We built up the fire as big as we could get it, piling on seasoned birch and oak logs. Frank reached into his truck cab, brought his 12-gauge pump shotgun out from behind the seat, racked a shell into the chamber, and laid the gun straight across his knees. He sat on a damp pine log, staring straight into the black woods beyond the firelight. Around 10 p.m., I noticed the campfire smoke. There was no wind, the forest air was totally dead and motionless, but the thick white smoke from our pine fire wasn't rising straight up into the trees. It was splitting into two distinct streams right above the flames. One stream of smoke was blowing hard to the east, and the other stream was blowing hard to the west. At the exact same time. "Frank," I said, pointing a shaking hand at the split smoke. He looked at the smoke, then slowly looked over at me. His face was pale in the firelight. "That's not right." Then the sound started. Asterisk clack. Clack. Clack dot asterisk. It came from the dark timber out in the direction of section 14. A rhythmic, woody tapping sound. Like someone taking two heavy blocks of seasoned oak or dense bone and slapping them together at steady, 3-second intervals. Asterisk clack, clack, clack dot asterisk. Frank picked up the 12-gauge and held it tight against his hip. The loud, metallic asterisk check check asterisk of the slide was the only normal, familiar sound out in those woods. "Is it an animal?" I asked softly, knowing damn well no animal made a sound like that. "No," Frank said, his eyes scanning the tree line. "It's not." We sat up all night by that fire. The clacking sound went on for hours without stopping. It didn't get any closer to our camp, but it didn't recede either. Just a steady, mechanical asterisk clack, e-clack asterisk echoing through the damp trees every 3 seconds until the first pale light of morning began to creep into the forest. When dawn finally broke, the drizzle had stopped, replaced by a thick, freezing fog that hung suspended in the branches like dirty cotton wool. "We have to go back down to the site," I said, pulling my boots back on. Frank looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Why the hell would we go back down there?" "We have to take photo records for the survey report," I told him, trying to keep my voice steady. "If we leave without documenting the plot terrain and boundary markers, the company voids our contract and we don't get paid for the whole week's work. We take 3 quick pictures of the bowl, we pack up the camp, and we drive out. 10 minutes, that's it." Frank hesitated, staring at the ground, then grunted, grabbed his shotgun, and followed me out of camp. We walked back toward the bowl through the cold morning grey. The fog was so thick you couldn't see more than 15 yards ahead. The tall white pines looked like ghost pillars looming out of the white haze. When we reached the top ridge of the glacial bowl, we stopped dead. The site had changed overnight. The hole in the middle of the clearing was wider. It had opened up by maybe 5 or 6 inches, the black mud around the lip sloughing down into the shaft. And the bone wall, the whole intricate spiral, had shifted position. You could see fresh, deep grooves dragged through the wet mud where the heavy bone walls had slid several feet inward toward the central shaft, like a wide funnel slowly settling deeper into the earth. And there were tracks in the mud. The dirt softened right beneath my feet. My heavy leather boot sank 3 inches into the soil, and the mud pulled back on my heels with a wet, heavy suction, like standing in quicksand. "Frank!" I screamed, pulling my foot free from the sinking mud. "Mark! Get out of there!" "Get to the ridge," his voice shouted from somewhere off to my right, sounding horribly muffled and distant through the white fog. I looked up into the haze, and through the white oat, I saw the dark tops of the massive white pines lining the rim of the bowl. They were bending. There wasn't a breath of wind in the air, but the 80-foot trees were leaning inward toward the center of the sinkhole at a steep 45-degree angle, their thick trunks creaking, snapping, and groaning under immense, unseen strain. Then the smell hit the back of my throat. Hot tallow. Like rendering raw beef lard over a hot stove, burnt animal fat, old copper, and scorched iron. I panicked completely. I threw my camera strap over my neck, lunged blindly into the fog, and my hand caught the shoulder strap of Frank's canvas jacket. I yanked him hard toward me, and we just ran. We didn't look for the cut survey trail. We didn't care about our gear left back at the camp. We just crashed through the dense thickets, tripping over hidden logs, tearing our oilskin jackets on thorn bushes, running completely blind away from that awful bowl. Behind us, the rattling suction sound grew louder and louder for 5 terrifying seconds, then abruptly cut off into total, dead silence. We burst out of the tree line onto the gravel logging road where our work truck was parked, threw our bodies into the cab, and slammed the doors shut. I fumbled the ignition keys twice, my hands shaking so hard I dropped them onto the floorboard before I finally got the engine started. I slammed the truck into drive, spraying gravel 20 feet into the brush, and tore down the logging road way faster than was safe for a slick, unpaved track. Neither of us said a word until we crossed the pavement onto Highway 54 heading west toward Black River Falls. Frank was staring out his passenger window, his knuckles white where he was gripping his 12-gauge shotgun across his lap. "We aren't going back for the camp gear," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," I said, keeping my eyes locked on the white lines of the highway. "We aren't." We called the forestry outfit from a diner outside town later that afternoon. We told the logging manager that we'd hit flooded, unstable terrain and impassable swamp conditions, cancelled the rest of our crew's contract, and forfeited our pay for the week. Frank packed up his house and moved out to Montana 6 months later. We don't talk much anymore. When we do catch up on the phone, neither of us ever brings up Wisconsin. About a year after it happened, I got curious late one night. I opened up my laptop and pulled up public satellite imagery of the forest, zooming into section 14 to see if the pine canopy looked any different from the aerial shots. The map coordinates for that specific glacial bowl are completely blacked out. Not pixelated or blurred like military property, just a crisp, round, pitch-black smudge overlaid right on top of the satellite photo, right where the clearing in the woods should be. A digital rendering error, probably. That's what I keep telling myself. The thing is, I live in a quiet apartment building in Eau Claire now. 3rd floor unit. It started about 3 months ago. Every few nights, at exactly 3:14 a.m., I snap wide awake out of a dead sleep. There's a tapping sound coming from inside my bedroom wall. Low down, right behind the wooden baseboard near the head of my bed. Asterisk clack, clack, clack dot asterisk. It's dry. It sounds like a piece of polished bone knocking rhythmically against the dry plaster. And last Tuesday, I came home from my shift at the lumber yard and found something sitting on my kitchen windowsill. On the inside ledge of the locked double-pane window. It was a deer tooth. Completely clean. Snow white. No dirt, no blood, no root rot. I picked it up with a paper towel and threw it straight into the dumpster down in the parking lot. But I haven't slept properly since that night, and every morning, around 3 a.m., I just lie there alone in the dark, watching the bedroom wall, waiting for the clacking to start up again,